Welcome back to the FantasyLabs podcast. This is Bryan. I'm here with Jay. We are in our fourth straight week. It's the fourth episode of our MLB GPP series where we talk about some sort of tournament. We've done a couple on DraftKings, and we're now on our second FanDuel tournament. And I think it's been going pretty cool. What's going on, Jay?
Just hanging out, Brian. Yeah, I agree. I think it's been going great. I've liked all our previous ones, and this one's special because we got preseason football starting tonight. So we got to watch that today. It's been a long time, and it's almost been as good as the Olympics. I mean, it was a great day.
Mm-hmm. Katie Ledecky, Michael Phelps. Dominant. I realized I was watching. I just get so into these events. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, I've never heard of some of these swimmers, and all of a sudden, like, I'm like, oh, the U.S. guy has a chance at gold, and I'm like the biggest fan. I never heard of him.
Yeah, they're good, man. I watched a lot today and this week, but I don't know. What do you think was better if you had to choose between Phelps winning his 22nd gold or Mark Sanchez tossing that touchdown to Marius Thomas? If you had to only pick one.
Oh gosh, I can't even pick between those two.
Yeah, I think it's pretty tough. Yeah. Definitely. And then I mean Phelps is just. I wish we could utilize him in some capacity of DFS. I would love, like, if you were a pitcher, can you imagine, getting his equal skill set? I would pay $19,000 for him on FanDuel.
I would too. Yeah,
that leaves you with $2K for every other position player.
Oh, is that what? Yeah, I would say whatever it was, we're at just the minimum.
I'd snap call. Yeah, snap call.
Yeah, for sure. Or if we have a Kike situation, I would even go more than that. But
we'll talk about that Kike situation, which just so happened to arise on this slate tomorrow. But let's talk a little bit about this single entry tournament.
Yeah, so we had talked last episode, which was an episode on the FanDuel $3 squeeze. We had done a lower entry DraftKings tournament, a high entry DraftKings tournament, and then we pivoted to FanDuel for episode 3 and did the $3 low entry squeeze, and I thought that went well. And we had said that we were going to do a high stakes tournament, and I think we'll still do that. I'm not sure if it'll be next week or a week after, but we did have some feedback, and we definitely appreciate that. We definitely appreciate the tweets, and however you want to follow up with us, you can send us an email podcast at FantasyLabs or send us a tweet, whatever. And we had a bunch of people request us do a specific podcast on strategy for single entry. So we decided to bump that up to episode 4 and to go ahead and do that now. So that is what we were going to discuss. We're going to discuss the single entry tournament on FanDuel, and we decided to pick just the biggest one available, just so we could get a pretty large sample here on ownership specifically, because I think that's a large part of it. So we decided to go with the Wednesday MLB Bunt, which is a single entry tournament. It was just $1 to enter, and it was 13,000 people in the tournament. Jay, so just a couple quick things I think I found interesting right up here at the top was that the scores, and I compared this to the $3 squeeze, because the $3 squeeze is 50,000 people, and it's there are 150 lineups. So I sort of wanted to compare the two to see what sort of changes we would see in ownership and the differences in score. And I think the first thing that was really interesting to me was that the scores overall and the ownership numbers weren't really that different. What are your thoughts on that?
It surprised me a little bit to hear that and to see that. I don't know. First, do you play single entry tournaments much, or is it kind of something you don't really focus on too much?
I don't really. I like the theory of them, and I appreciate that they're available to players, especially ones who don't like multi-entry or don't have the bankroll to be able to play in some of the everyone regardless of your bankroll, I think if you have good sound strategy can play in these even multi-entry tournaments. But if you just sort of get overwhelmed by seeing guys who are really good who play multiple entry lineups, I love that it's an option for DFS users. I don't personally play them myself. I guess the reason is that the tournaments like the $3 tournament and the going up there to the 27 or whatever on DK just has higher payout structure, which I go for. And I like the thrill of like creating multiple lineups and differentiating myself and stuff. It's just a different sort of way of approaching things. I think I guess maybe we could talk about whether a single entry is sort of geared toward a GPP player or a cash game player, or whether it's sort of in the middle. I guess we can start there. What are your thoughts on that? Like, what sort of players does this tournament lend itself to?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really interesting to dissect overall. I don't think too many people have really gotten that deep into them because the prize pools aren't that enticing to the average player. Obviously, they all want the big prize pools, so these kind of get cast aside. But I think it's really interesting that a lot of these other tournaments we've broken down, or just big tournaments in general, multi-entry, we have all of these professional DFS players, really good guys, made a lot of money that we can analyze and kind of emulate their process, see how they diversified their exposure, the core of players that they went in on that night. And in single entry, we don't really have any of that. It's just one lineup per person. So, yeah, like you just said, I'm not a huge fan of single entry myself. I don't go out of my way to play them all or spend a lot of time focusing on them. But I agree. I think they're great for the industry when people don't really want to match up bankroll to bankroll. And it kind of, in a way, levels the playing field, and people aren't as intimidated. But I think at the same thing, the biggest advantage to these single entry tournaments is that a lot of these pros that make a lot of money in multi-entry tournaments don't have that same advantage because their skill set isn't really geared towards these type of tournaments. And that skill set, whether it's managing hundreds of lineups, adjusting these lineups near lineup lock with minutes to spare in NBA, for example, perfectly setting exposure to multiple offenses, even late swapping dozens of teams to create plus EV situations, that kind of all goes out the window, those skill sets. So it's a much more level playing field. So I think it attracts all players still, but I think the amount that people put into it differs. For me, I play them. I just put my cash in them. So I think that's the bottom line there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point you made, and I'm glad that you made it. It is definitely a skill set to do multi-inter tournaments, and like that's definitely a debate. Like I don't want to get into with people. People just say that all you have to do is just put in, you have a big bankroll and throw in 150 lineups, and you just clean up. And then other people say, okay, well you can do that in 25% tournament, and then it's just people arguing against each other. That's not a fun conversation. I agree that I definitely think there's skill sets involved. I do think that it takes a definite skill set to be really good with a single lineup, especially in a tournament like this. I think players who are really good with single entry GPPs are a different type of player than I am. And I think that is definitely a skill set to be able to manage 150 lineups and be able to create exposures and a core in such a way to, maximize the odds of taking down that tournament. But definitely a different strategy. So yeah, that's what I was going to ask you is, what sort of lineup would you throw in? And it sounds like it's just sort of what you do is just throw your cash game lineup, in these smaller entry tournaments, because you might as well, like if your cash game lineup goes off, all of a sudden you have the upside of taking it down.
Yeah, exactly. It's an ROI booster for me on those nights where your cash lineup's a top 5%, top 3%. You get a little more back. You increase your EV and your ROI at the same time. So for me, I sit and you look through the lobby, you scroll through, and you get in games, your cash games, whatever, and you see single entries, whatever the buy-in really. I mean, $50 single entries, it doesn't really matter. But for me, I throw my cash team in. I think that's what a lot of other pros do too. They throw their cash team in. So these are a lot of tournaments. That's why I was kind of surprised by the overall ownership percentages. But at the same time, you don't have these pros who win these tournaments regularly at the top as much because they themselves are kind of throwing in their cash lineups.
Yeah, so that is definitely interesting, and something that I am trying to figure out exactly. What is the optimal way to approach a single entry tournament? Because I agree that I definitely think it is a great way to boost your ROI of your cash game entry, and it's just sort of a sneaky way to get that upside with your cash game lineups. Just throw it in a single entry tournament. You don't have to worry about the multi entry, and if it goes off, it's in the top percentile. All of a sudden, you get that extra cash on the side. But with the ownerships the way that we saw them here, with the bunt and the squeeze being sort of similar, I'm sort of curious if people are actually doing that. Are they actually throwing their cash game lineup into these tournaments, or are they going contrarian with their one lineup just because they think they have to? I'm curious. What are your thoughts on that? Because in theory, I figured that people would approach it. They would be more chalky. If you only have one lineup, sort of like a cash game lineup, like you should just play the more optimal plays, which would make the tournament just a chalky tournament in general. So whereas a 50,000 person tournament with 150 lineup max, you can spread distribution and exposure among teams, which means that the lower teams, the teams like Arizona tonight, going against, or Arizona today going against Syndergaard, a team implied for 2.9 runs, they can have a little bit higher exposure in the squeeze because you can afford to take that risk with 150 lineups. Doing that in a tournament like this, it seems like not many people would do it. But with the ownership sort of matching up, what are your thoughts? Do you think people are just sort of playing better strategy in these tournaments where they're just like understanding that it's going to be contrarian to take it down?
I think the contrarian aspect is still there overall. We have to remember, even when pros put in the max amount of entries, there is still like a 3%, roughly 3% entry cap. So it's not going to swing the pendulum too much if a pro puts in his cash lineup compared to 150 lineups. Given the size of these tournaments, it's not going to swing the percentages that much when his lineups make up roughly 3% of the entire field. So I think you look at it more from a point of, are pros winning these tournaments a lot because they're putting in their cash? I still think they're putting in their cash game lineups in these because it's not worth the time for a lot of these pros to get these smaller prize pools to really break down the optimal, maybe contrarian tournament team, and they'll just throw their cash tournament team in these because for a lot of people, they're attacking one or two big tournaments and putting in a lot of teams and focusing on that. They're not really going to spend the time to focus on a single entry, single tournament lineup. So I think while the percentages are still there, you kind of look at the top and see who wins these single entry tournaments. And as far as the process, I think it's pretty similar. And that's the other side that indicates with the ownership percentages that you still do have to get contrarian. I think you're right in that a lot of people probably don't take as many risks with just one lineup. You would think they'd be more chalkier, but I think this proves that you still have to be contrarian in these, just like you do in the large field.
Yeah, and I think this would be different for different sports. Like, I think if we were talking about an NBA single entry, it would be a much more chalky tournament. But I think just the variance of MLB, I think sort of lends itself to maybe being more similar in ownership to the squeeze that we sort of see it, as it happened last night. So I'm curious, let's get into sort of practical how you would handle this. So the fact that the ownerships and, I guess the scores don't really matter that much, whether they're similar, but the ownerships sort of matter. That's just everything for the tournament, how you should handle strategy. In my mind, if it's going to be the same, then I think that you sort of just approach it the same way that you approach other tournaments, like the 10 ways to be contrarian, like those things that we talked about, like, target a team that's implied in like the 4-5-ish range of runs. It's not a team that's going to be in like the high fives that everyone is on, but not a team that just doesn't have a crazy low upside, but a team that's still implied to score a lot of runs. It's going to be sort of moderately owned and sort of and be contrarian in that way. I think those ways, the 10 ways we talked about, sort of just apply. I wasn't expecting going into that, and maybe we're looking at a small variance or just a small sample of tournaments. It would be different for another one. We have to check that out. But if it's going to be the same ownership wise, then I don't think strategy changes that much.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't at all. I think there's enough people to where ownership is ownership. And if this happens every night with these single entry tournaments compared to the squeeze, for example, then you still have to embrace the variance of the sport. And I completely agree. This is way different with MLB, just the nature of the sport, the high variance compared to NBA. I think you're right. You can take a safer way, or these tournaments, single entry will be more cash game oriented than MLB, but with the high variance, I think you look at the principles of some of our previous podcasts and kind of incorporate and utilize those same strategies in this tournament, even though it's a different format. And I think looking at the winning lineup, and with this, I don't want to look too much into the winning lineup. This was definitely an interesting slate, but something on the winning lineup was something we brought up, I believe, in our first pod that we did after the 10 ways to be contrarian, where we talked about gaining exposure to a lower owned player in a stack. at the same position as another player on that team who's higher owned. And the first example was when Hanley hit 3 home runs and he was really, really low owned compared to David Ortiz. And then on this winning team, you look at the Blue Jays stack, which littered kind of the top 10 in this tournament, and you have Justin Smoke at 0.6% owned over Edwin Encarnacion. So kind of same process of strategy going on there.
Yeah, exactly. And the strategy is just that you're still getting the exposure to the high upside of that offense. You're just getting it at a lower ownership. And I do think that especially for a guy like Smoke, he is particularly intriguing just because if you look at his splits, this is a guy who has, a mid-twos ISO. It's a guy with a lot of power potential. He hit 8th in this game. He's usually, in the 6 to 7, 8 range or whatever on a normal lineup. But honestly, the only reason that he's really hitting in that range is just because Toronto is so stacked with batters. Like when you have Bautista and you have Encarnacion, you have Tulo, and you have all these guys like and Josh Donaldson, obviously. Yeah. I mean, you could have a really talented guy with a lot of power and Smoke, and he's just not really – he's not going to hit in the top spot because those are taken, I think this is a guy who would probably hit in a 5-hole or higher on just about every other team in the majors, yet, he's in the 7th or 8th spot. So I think those are really intriguing in particular. Is not only the first base thing with Encarnacion that we talked about with Hanley and Ortiz, but just spotting, inaccuracy or inerrancy or whatever you want to call it in the way that the manager, places his lineups, regardless of whether that's his fault or not. And we talked about that, we like stacks that aren't straight stacks because that assumes that the manager is sort of perfect at creating lineups. And we often see, like, if you like in our player models, one of my favorite things to do, and I know you do this, you've showed on the MLB live shows, is when you just pull up a team, filter that team so you only have their batters, and just sort by ISO. And you can see that, like, very rarely, if you sort by ISO, if you sort by sort of the idea of being projected power, rarely is like the top ISO, the top best power hitters that you would want for a tournament in 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's not. And oftentimes you can get a guy with high upside outside of the first base thing in a low ownership spot at the bottom of a lineup like Smoke. So he's sort of a double whammy for me. A great play. 0.6% owned is ridiculous.
Yeah, and even on the same winning lineup, it was a Blue Jays stack, of course, and you had some chalk. Tulo was high owned. But then he also had Gary Sanchez at 2.7% owned, another hitter. He got 31 points, who has that power upside near the bottom of the lineup. And I think these are things, especially in single entry tournaments, that you want to look at. You want to take these risks because everybody else is trying to make that optimal lineup, you could say, to where they're not really going to look that deep and take these risks. So you see Smoke at 0.6%, Gary Sanchez at 2.7. You hit it with your pitcher, your stack is the stack that goes off that night, and all of a sudden you have a chance at first place in these things.
Yeah, I agree. And while I will say that I don't think strategy's really, really that different, just based on the tournament that we dove into here, from a, how to be contrarian mindset, when we're talking about our 10 ways, I don't think that you necessarily handle it any different. You can still use those 10 ways. I will say that I do think that single entry tournaments make stacking more important. Because, in a big tournament, when you have 50,000 people, or if you're playing an even bigger tournament, whatever it may be, stacking, part of the thing that we like stacking, we've really talked about this a lot, but it's something that we believe in. It's something I think is very undervalued. Stacking actually minimizes your risk because if you take up 4 spots for a team and they go off, not only are you getting the points from all 4 of those spots, but you don't have to hit on those 4 spots. If you only take one guy for a team that scores 15 runs, that's great. You're getting all the points from that guy. And it sucks because you're missing the rest of them, but also you have to hit on those other spots. So it actually minimizes your risk. And I think in a big field tournament, there's more of a chance where that could happen. Like there could be a lineup where a guy doesn't have a stack and just sort of just hits on every lineup spot, independent of a stack. Whereas this is much less likely to happen in a single entry tournament, which I think, even though the ownerships aren't any different, I think stacking is more important in a single entry tournament for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And real quick, I think the reason we're not breaking down this slate as much as kind of the process for single entries, because this was for sure a very, very interesting slate with kind of how it ended up. I think 15 teams scored 3 runs or less in the 12-game slate. So only 3 teams scored more than 4 runs. So this isn't the best tournament to pick and use an example of stacking and 4-player stacks, 2-team 4-player stacks. Because it didn't really hit. So you had a lot of whiffs with team stacks, which certainly happens. Almost every single team implied the score a lot busted. And it just kind of shows you that you don't want to really go that route in every single tournament. You got to get contrarian still with those adverse of Vegas lines. So the Blue Jays were the team that kind of came through with 7 runs here. Tulo, obviously a big play on the slate. We could talk about pitchers, though, a little on the slate. We did have some chalk hit. I think Jay Happ was the highest owned pitcher in this tournament.
Yeah, he was. I thought that him and Verlander would be close, and Happ was about 17, and Verlander ended up being about 11.
Yeah, yeah, that was kind of surprising. I think Verlander is clearly kind of the best pitcher of recent performance going into this one. But Happ had a lot of things going for him. Obviously, I mean, he was high in the models, and I think he was a good play. And kind of same principles apply. You can get that Blue Jays stack with Happ or whatever, like the winning team did, and then just kind of get exposure to some lower-owned guys. Freddie Freeman's a guy that I think was a day late of when we wanted to utilize some Brave stacks, but he came through with 2 home runs of their 3 total runs. Lucroy was some chalk that came through. We had Chris Carter, a contrarian tournament play, who came through. There were a lot of guys kind of as part of a team, and that's what happens when a lot of these teams score 3 runs. You just have guys here and there kind of putting together some big performances. So in hindsight, you got to, on the slate, nail your pitcher and then fill in a Toronto stack with guys with home run power upside.
Yeah, and one thing I'll mention real quick, and this is just more anecdotal than anything, because I don't want to pull this as a hindsight thing, but the Yankees scored 9 runs, but you actually didn't see many of their players in the top of the tournament lineups, and I think that there is an edge. It might be a small edge. I'm not quite sure how big it is to really diving in to figure out, when a team is implied at 5 runs, let's say the Red Sox and the Astros are both implied at 5 runs for a game. What does that mean exactly? Vegas is just implying 5 runs. That's their prediction. But what does that mean for you? Does that mean, based on the pitchers that they're facing, that those are likely to be home runs? Does that mean that they're likely to be, death by singles? What does that mean exactly? Because that makes a lot of a difference in tournament. You obviously want these extra base hits and you want these home runs. And, so targeting a team that may be implied to score a lot of points, but doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of home run potential, or is facing a guy with a bad whip, but, it has a really high ground ball rate. It's a lot different than a guy who has, give ups a lot of home runs. So I think that's sort of a sneaky way to differentiate yourself when you're looking at these Vegas lines.
Yeah, there's clearly a lot more you have to look at than just on the surface Vegas lines. The biggest positive you can do to look at these Vegas lines on the surface is gauge ownership and kind of understand that, okay, if this team's implied at 5.5 runs, it's likely going to carry pretty high ownership. But yeah, you have to look into the opposing pitcher, I think, and kind of look at his home run rate. Does he give up a lot of bombs? Does the offense you want to take hit a lot of bombs? I mean, I think I probably made a mistake the other day having Braves exposure when that's just an offense that doesn't really hit home runs. I mean, I'm not Markakis has been on fire and he's been hitting well, but is he really dropping bombs? Is he getting the points that I need to take down these tournaments? Sure, they could still score 7 runs, but it's not going to be that pretty usually. So you kind of want these offenses. I mean, the Astros are a good example. The Cardinals, as of late, who just drop bombs like crazy. Twins, of course, as of late. So you have a lot of offenses that I think you want to stack more than certain offenses because of that, how you get those runs, the upside that's in those. So I think that's something you got to consider. And then I think you should look at bullpens too and kind of look, okay, the starting pitcher's going to throw 6 innings. What about the last 3? Who am I facing? What's the upside of facing this bullpen or that bullpen?
Yeah, for sure. A good example of that was last year, I think, was Kansas City. They were a team that was always implied to score a lot of runs. great team last year, obviously. But definitely wasn't a team that was just going to bomb like 7 home runs a game, just more of like just played really smart baseball and ended up having a lot of singles and drove in a lot of runs, which is great. That's great for real life baseball. But
we don't care about that.
Yeah.
Don't care.
Yeah. Like we'll take 4 home runs over a 9-run all singles game, That's just sort of how baseball works. So definitely a sneaky thing to remember. Anything else on this tournament, or you want to jump into something we talked about off air?
Yeah, we could talk. The last thing, I think the most surprising thing in this tournament, or on this slate, I guess I could say, was Edwin Jackson just throwing a gem. Do you have any insight on that?
No, I missed that, dude. I pulled up his ownership earlier, and it was minuscule, as you would expect, which sort of just says everything that you need to know about that play. Sometimes people throw gems, and good for them.
It's important to remember that. I think you look at Edwin. He had a good game against the Brewers in his previous start. He had an affordable price. I think, especially for these single entry tournaments, you're not putting in a lot of risk yourself. You might not be getting a huge prize, but if you're just putting in $1, I think you want to take risks on maybe not Edwin every start, but kind of guys in that situation. Another one who stood out a little bit, and this isn't a great example because I don't want to roster him too often, but Ross Detweiler came out with 8 shutout innings on the slate, only 2 strikeouts, of course, which limits his upside, but he had a good score in shutout innings, and he was priced at just $5,500. So I think there are a lot of instances that play to your advantage in these single entry tournaments where you can afford to take these risks because you only have one lineup and you're not putting in that much risk overall in this tournament. So I think in this tournament in general, the single entry, it's something to, I think, for new players kind of explore dealing with contrarian plays and whatnot, even if you don't want to play 5 entries in the squeeze or whatever, or even a similar $1 entry. You can make lineups and track them as well. So I think you play the single entry tournament. If you have a really, really small bankroll and you're not comfortable putting that much in play, you can kind of focus and practice on these contrarian lineups, track your other teams if you're not ready yet, and just kind of gauge ownership levels, how your teams are doing, if you would cash, if you did this or that, and just kind of remember that single entry tournaments especially, you're going to lose a lot more consistently than if you throw in 50 teams and at least get some to cash. So I think it's a long process to kind of cash in these consistently, and I don't think anybody really does long term in a consistent basis. You're obviously looking to play for first place in these.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. I just found Edwin Jackson's ownership, 0.3% ownership.
I saw.
At 54, 7 innings pitched, 7 strikeouts, and a win.
Man.
Just rolled the Pirates.
Who were implied to score, I think, like 5.5. So that's another reason to kind of just not take Vegas too seriously, other than projecting ownership and things of that nature.
Right. And one thing I do want to mention before we move on to, we have a topic that we'll introduce in just one second, just because I think it's a unique and rare and interesting, and I definitely want to talk about it real quick. But real quick, this doesn't pertain to this tournament, but it was actually one today. We were talking about the Bunt on Wednesday. We're recording this on Thursday night, but this had to do with Thursday early slate, and it's just sort of another example I want to talk about. Syndergaard was one of the chalkier pitchers on the slate. He was facing an Arizona team, applied a score of 2.9 points. I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, but they went off for 9 runs, and these guys, that have high upside. We're talking Paul Goldschmidt, who's a guy who's been an MVP candidate for the last several years. I mean, a guy that hasn't been a little bit more down this year, but a guy that we know is still a really talented batter. And not the Arizona Diamondbacks are the best team in the world, but baseball is just a high variance sport. These guys were less than percent owned, and the guys who had the stones to roster them against Syndergaard and sort of like not only fade Syndergaard, so you're getting that play, but also to sort of directly oppose him if the Diamondbacks go off. These guys are just went right up onto the leaderboards of their tournaments, scoring 9 runs, and those guys won the tournaments. And we've seen this time after time. Last week, I had stacked against Salazar for Minnesota, and we've seen this a bunch. it's if you're going to play multi-entry, I know this isn't a single thing, but throw in at least one stack against the top implied pitcher. Like it's just like you never know. Like baseball is a high variance sport, and it's just a very good contrarian option.
Yeah, I mean, it happens seriously every single night. I mean, we don't need to go over it every single time it happens, but just make sure you acknowledge that it happens. And you can't always play the safe, optimal lineup every night because everybody else comes to that same result. So I think another note, you can pick a player from this team, for example, to go off. I mean, Goldschmidt, Trout, they're good hitters. You can get hits off good pitchers. So if you're playing chalky teams and you want to pick some standalone tournament plays, look at those types of hitters who might not be in good spots, and you'll get them at under 5% ownership, and they're still top 5 hitters in the league. So they're not getting all their at-bats against Syndergaard. They're not getting all their at-bats against Kershaw, for example. So they still have that upside that you're getting severely discounted. So, yeah, it's another thing that you can focus on in single-entry tournaments and multi-entry tournaments.
Yeah, people just get so enamored with the pitcher that they're putting in their cash game lineup. A guy like Syndergaard or Salazar, where they just, they don't want to stack against them even for a single lineup because they've sort of just spent all day talking themselves into how this is such a great play. Just a lineup or two, just do it. And, often it won't go off. Those guys are good pitchers for a reason, but when it does, you're going to put yourself in just such a good spot to vault up the leaderboard. Okay, let's finish up here talking about something. I'll let you introduce it, Jay, since you brought it to my attention.
Yeah, it's an example from our first pod, 10 Ways to Be Contrarian. It was the night after Kike Hernandez was slightly mispriced. I said, don't put too much thought into it because I doubt it'll ever happen again, or very rarely. But sure enough, here we are 4 pods later, and we have Alex Rodriguez in his final game of his career, priced at $696 on FanDuel tomorrow. We do have some tournaments in his name, which we'll mention because I do think they carry meaning. I think this is a different situation than the Kike Hernandez for multiple reasons. I think the Kike was kind of more a Twitter thing, and you look at DFS players who are regulars. You don't have to call them pros. People who play a lot are active on Twitter. Everybody knew about it, but that still represents a somewhat small population of total DFS players. But this thing, I think, is, since it's deliberate, it's kind of pointed out, hey, A-Rod's last game, here are 2 tournaments named after him. His price we're setting at his career home run record, which I think they should have made $697 and kind of called their shot, but they don't have the guts to really do that. That would have been really cool. But anyway, so with this price, we can talk about this since this is one of the original ideas we have to be contrarian, an example of this situation. First of all, what are your thoughts going into this with his price? Mm-hmm. Are you kind of taking it?
Yeah, so the Kike thing I used to my advantage and took the salary discount by rostering him. And I was planning on doing that regardless of whether he was going to play. He ended up playing, so it sort of didn't matter.
He got 0 too.
He got 0, which is fine for me just because the opportunity cost was worth it for me. The ability to get up just a little bit higher with a pitcher that I liked and to sort of, maybe get a better stack or a 2-man or 2-team stack than I wanted was worth it in some instances, or 4-3, whatever with Kike. But that was a little different in that it was, you're right, like it was an accident and the DFS community. I mean, DFS Twitter, just people on DFS sites really sort of knew about the casual players who were just coming for the first time onto FanDuel, putting in their lineup without sort of interacting with the DFS community. Didn't realize it, and we saw that reflected by his, 10-12% ownership. So
yeah. I think A-Rod will be higher.
Yeah, the fact that, this was intentional, the fact that they have, contest name after him. Everyone knows A-Rod. Like, he's going to be on SportsCenter, literally every second for the next couple of days, other than Phelps and Ledecky. Ledecky and should always be on.
Seriously, I would watch her 24/7.
First off, how dare A-Rod retire during the Ledecky and Phelps reign?
He's never had class in his career. What's going to change?
How dare him?
Yeah, man. I mean, yeah.
Why can we not have a Ledecky DraftKings tournament?
I don't know, where we all get to play Ledecky and just split the prize pool and pay rake. I would still do it.
I would pay rake.
Just to roster her.
In honor of Ledecky.
Yeah, it should go to her too. She deserves all of my money.
She's the greatest person I've
She is the greatest. But with this A-Rod thing, I think, I mean, first of all, I can give my opinion on this and say I'm going nowhere near A-Rod.
I'm fading it. Yeah, like you said, it's something that everyone's going to know. So his ownership's going to be inflated. And I think the important thing that we both agree on is he's not good. Like,
Oh my God, he's so bad. I mean, there are a lot of people that put some stock into this type of situation. I don't want to name names, but Pete is an of he'll probably be all over this. So just A-Rod the GOAT, his last game. He's yeah, a huge narrative street, and I mean, this is just so important to say. You're not by rostering him, you're not changing his legacy. The last game he ever plays will not define his legacy. I don't think he has any extra incentive. It's not like he went up there today and didn't try to hit the ball. He tried, and he hit it like 8 feet. So if you want to roster him and get a weak ground out to the pitcher twice and a couple strikeouts, then go ahead. But I'm not playing him because this last game. I'm not playing him because of the price, because of the projected ownership, which is another thing that kind of creates more similar lineups when you have that much to save on a player. Not only is that guy high, but it kind of leads you to other similar roster constructions. If you want to stack those top teams, everybody who's saving that salary will gravitate towards that strategy. So for those reasons, and because I fully expect A-Rod to finish with 0 points, I'm pretty comfortable just fading him entirely.
Yep, I agree 100% with everything you said. The opportunity cost is intriguing, but the downside outweighs that for sure.
Yeah, and he's horrible. I mean, it's been so bad lately. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad we talked about single entry.
Yeah.
You guys, like you said, we did have a lot of people kind of ask about it. So ultimately, I would treat these pretty similar to the other tournaments we talked about. And more importantly, I think for new players or for people who don't have the bankroll to really throw in a lot of teams and want to focus on these small ones, don't kind of get scared off by the small prize pools and just cast them aside. I still think first they're really good practice to kind of build and construct teams and focus on one team at a time. And then when you're comfortable with that, maybe then you can move on to a 3-entry max tournament or whatever. And while the prize pools aren't as lucrative, I do think if you focus on these over time and get good at them, spotting contrarian plays plus EV situations, you're not going to get that chain on the first night. But over time, if you keep cashing these, you get a different jewel every night. And before you know it, at the end of the season, you'll be balling just like the person who took down the squeeze or whatever, a bigger tournament.
Yeah, for sure. And on that note, I will end it saying this. I love the idea of throwing your cash game lineup in these single entry tournaments. If you do not do that, if you just sort of throw in a lineup, or even if it is your cash game lineup, throw it in the squeeze too. It's only an extra $2. The guy who won this tournament, I'm not going to throw shade on his name or anything. The guy who won this tournament, the bunt, took home $1,000. It's great. His score, 223.4, would have been third place in the squeeze, which would have been $4K. So, just an extra $2 would have brought in an extra $4K. So the opportunity cost is what, $2? If you're already just playing the $1, just if you're going to play single entry, just throw the line up in the $3 squeeze just in case.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think if you have the money in your account or proportionate to how much you're playing that night and you are focusing just on single entry, or play kind of the tournaments that fit your bankroll a bit, maybe you only had $1 left.
Maybe $1 left. Yeah, and I'm not trying to shame this guy. I'm not saying that if you shoot that, throw it in the slugger, which is the $1,000 entry. Don't do that.
Yeah, for sure. I agree, and I can't tell you how many times I've made that same mistake forgetting to enter a tournament or whatever, not putting your cash lineup in a small tournament.
Donkey move, Jay.
Yeah, it's really bad, and I always do it and always get the end results of frustration. But I think single entry, you got to play them still, and there's still money to be made. So that's kind of the bottom line with these, and I think the process is really similar.
Process is similar. Stacking is important. Yeah, I think we've gone over all that for sure. So I guess we'll end it there. Thanks again, as always, for interacting with us on Twitter. And an email and letting us know what you guys want to hear. These podcasts are definitely for you guys, so we'll definitely gear them around to what you want to hear. So we have got some requests to do one of the 3 max tournaments. So I think that we'll work that in, and I still think that we should do a high stakes FanDuel tournament. So I don't know how much longer we'll keep on going for this. Maybe we'll just keep on rolling and do a couple of NFL slates. I don't know, but shoot us Twitter tweets.
That works.
Twitter tweets and let us know what you want, and we'll just keep on rolling because I think these are fun and they're helpful for me, regardless of whether they're.
Yeah, you're the one who banked that the other day, so yeah. I mean, I'm a man of the people, so whatever you guys want us to break down or talk about, just holler and we'll get it done. We can do it. I think the plan is now, the tentative plan is to do a kind of high stakes FanDuel tournament.
Yep, and then we'll move from there. So, all right. Well, good luck to you guys. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Good luck, guys.